Hello, welcome to another episode of Test, Optimize, and Scale. I am delighted to have Faz Chowdhury here with us today, CEO, founder, Nomura Medical. Going to be talking about growth of the organization, how they've launched on NASDAQ, going to be able to look at some of the inner workings that got Faz and the company there. Faz, thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having us on today.
Excellent. Excellent. And thought we'd begin with your background, your story, get to learn a bit more about you before we start talking Nomura Medical.
Yeah, well, I trained originally as a drug formulation scientist, in fact, and I then subsequently went on to do a master's in nanotechnology and microsystems, which has absolutely nothing to do with drug formulations.
Sure.
I then went on to do a doctorate in nanomedicine. So and those were kind of intentional. Ultimately, the idea was that I realized early on that, look, if you're going to innovate, if you want to be at the forefront of innovation and developing new technologies, you have got to start combining disciplines. And that was the whole idea behind my master's and my doctorate. And that indeed has led me to where I am today from a technical perspective. But essentially, I'm a technologist at heart. I tend to look for challenges, look for technical problems or unmet clinical needs, and then we go out there and try and find solutions for those.
So taking drug formulation, taking your passion, your master's expertise, as a technologist, organization expert, combining those disciplines, and that ultimately led you down the path, the roadmap to form Nomura Medical.
It did indeed. Yes, that's right. When I originally started out as a formulator, I recognized that there was an issue with regards to getting drugs into the body, in that if you were able to do it through the skin, you can bypass a lot of the common side effects that are associated with the oral administration, for example, of drugs, because you essentially bypass liver metabolism. And at the time, there were literally only about 9 or 10 drugs out of thousands that were being administered through the skin. So I thought, well, let's actually develop some platforms that can allow us to administer a whole bunch of more drugs through the skin. And that's where it really all started out. And from there, it evolved into, well, hang on, here's an application. What we've been looking at all the way long was getting drugs into the body through the skin. But how about taking things out? Because the platforms that we've developed actually lend themselves to taking things out of the skin. And that's essentially how Nomura Medical came about, because then we thought, okay, well, let's do some proof of concept. We did some proof of concept, and we essentially ended up with a viable product that allows us to take things out of the skin and measure it on the surface of the skin. And as you rightly point out, that's exactly how Nomura Medical was born.
So topicals, getting things in the skin, but what you're pointing out is getting it out, being able to test, and the opportunity, the possibilities that emerge from there.
Yes, that's right. Ultimately, if you think about when we are basically, let's say, trying to figure out how our general health is, the way we do it is, for example, if we want to lose weight, well, you weigh yourself. If you want to know your blood pressure, you get a blood pressure cuff and you monitor your blood pressure. And of course, if you want to measure your blood glucose or something of that nature, then you take a blood sample and you stick it on a strip and you measure it. And the way technology is moving on, wearable platform technologies that allow us to measure a whole lot more than just, let's say, blood sugar is going to be the norm in the next, let's say, within the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's why we embarked on initially looking at, well, what one substance could we measure that could have far-reaching, let's say, applications or use for a large population, let's say, okay? And we picked glucose monitoring for the simple reason that with glucose monitoring, on the one hand, you've got 500 million people around the world with diabetes, but also in terms of general metabolic health and wellness, it's actually important to know whether you get spikes in sugar levels in a way that is not characteristic of somebody with, let's say, good metabolic health. And one of the, of course, one of the rationales or reasons for developing a technology like that is that with medicine, if we're able to identify things early on enough, well, you can either completely prevent the onset of certain chronic disease conditions, or at least you can manage it a lot better by starting to manage it sooner. And so therefore, we focused on looking at glucose monitoring, and the technology platform that we've developed right now is a wearable body sensor, and it has applications both in the consumer healthcare space as well as in the clinical space. And in clinical application, we excuse me. So in the clinical application, essentially what we've developed is a transmitter that is rechargeable, and then a daily disposable sensor. And the idea is that you plug in the sensor into the device and you click it in, you peel off the backing liner, and then you apply it to the arm. And then over the course of the day, every 5 minutes, you get a direct reading from the transmitter to your mobile phone. So it goes directly to your mobile phone. So if I was to show you, for example, an example of somebody's data here. And as you can see on food intake, there's a spike there. And
yes.
then it falls. Now, in the event that, so that is somebody with diabetes, and you can see it's quite a large spike. Now, somebody who does not have diabetes, that spike should not be anywhere near that level. But of course, here's the thing. If, for example, somebody was, let's say, they thought they were pre-diabetic, okay? How would they test it? Well, you go and do an oral glucose tolerance test, for example. But again, when you think about the cost involved, the time involved, the resource involved, it's all very intensive, right? So here you've potentially got an avenue whereby literally a few dollars, stick a sensor on the device, stick it on your arm, and in literally one day, maybe once every 3 months, every 6 months, you stick a sensor on just to see to what extent you get that spike on challenging yourself with, let's say, certain food types. And that tells you the state of your metabolic health. And you see, one of the questions I get asked is, well, yeah, but surely, you can just take a blood finger prick sample, right? A finger prick, take a blood drop and put it on a strip and you get a reading. Well, here's the thing. Here's the issue with that, and that is, so let me give you an analogy. I use it, and it's a very crude analogy, but let's say you're interested in following the stock of a particular company, and your only insight into that is you're allowed one phone call at any time of day to your friend who will tell you what the stock price is at that particular time when you call him or her, and that's it. You're blind to the rest. What happens before, what happens after. Well, how useful is that to you? That's exactly like saying, well, I'll take a blood finger prick and I'll take a finger prick blood sample and put it on a strip. Well, I only know that point in time measurement. I have no idea what's happening around that. And really what you want to know is, what does my profile look like when I've consumed a certain amount of glucose? Because that's how my body is dealing with the glucose, and therefore the extent of insulin sensitivity, for example, and therefore the state of my metabolic health. And the reason this is so important is because there are so many disease conditions, chronic disease conditions, that are predisposed by elevated sugar levels or insulin sensitivity, lack of, let's say, for example. So therefore, what we found ourselves now is in a position where we can address both the clinical market as well as the consumer healthcare space, i.e. a space where people can hopefully, on a preventive basis, look at their sugar levels or their insulin sensitivity not only at an affordable price, but also in a way that's actually relatively unobtrusive, let's say.
And through your wearable, Sugar Beat, you're able to monitor, you're able to get those readings every 5 minutes. Like you mentioned, the analogy of a stock price and only getting that one reading versus the gauge of how it fluctuated throughout the day. You're not getting any candlesticks, you're not getting anything. It's just that one number. And like you said, for someone who is diabetic, pre-diabetes, they can see, oh wow, that this fluctuation is really occurring. You were also mentioning other genetic conditions, other health conditions as a whole, that this is so important for. You're able to see those fluctuations, too much sugar, not enough sugar, in the blood flow, in the levels. And as you mentioned, this is going to be huge over the next 5 years, and you guys are currently at the forefront of that.
Mm-hmm. We believe so. So currently, there's no other technology that has been approved as a medical device anywhere in the world that we're aware of, where you have a non-invasive daily wear sensor. So in that sense, we do believe that we are at the forefront. So this particular sensor is a Class 2B medical device approved in Europe for use in Europe, and we are currently in the process of registering it in the Middle East. And then there are a number of other territories outside of Europe, and including Middle East, that will accept the CE approval as a medical device for registration purposes, so without having to get reapproval, for example. And these are countries that include places like Australia, Hong Kong, Russia, and then you've got India, and then you've got South America, etc. And we've also filed the PMA application in the US, so we're awaiting FDA review. Now, the thing is that there are two other key technologies on the market that offer continuous monitoring. Okay, and they also have a transmitter and they have a sensor. The key difference is that in both of those cases, they have a sensor filament that is about 1 centimeter long, which protrudes from the center of the device, and it is then applied into the arm using a needle to basically insert the filament in the arm. And so those are invasive, and those sensors lend themselves extremely well to the management, in particular, of type 1 diabetes and anybody who has diabetes that is on intensive insulin therapy. Because in that kind of category, you're in a scenario where ideally you really should be monitoring yourself, on a regular basis, like almost 24/7, every single day of your life. Because the point is that you don't really know what's going to impact your sugar level, and therefore you want to know what it is so that you can modulate it with medication or other interventions, for example. And both those devices are doing extremely well in terms of market penetration. Now, bear in mind, though, that about 10% of people with diabetes have type 1. So you still have 90% of the market that is in the type 2 domain. So what does it mean to be type 2? Type 2 is predominantly lifestyle based, okay? So let me give you another analogy. So let's say if you're trying to lose weight, right? If you go on a diet. Now, if you want to, you can weigh yourself every single day, and you can plot the graph and see what the progress is that you're making. Or do you know what? Because it's lifestyle based and you're making the interventions, you could just weigh yourself at the end of every month, let's say. You get to see the progress. You get to see the difference over time. Well, similarly, here with managing, let's say, type 2 diabetes, and of course, without doubt, in terms of the pre-diabetes space, what we're saying is that because it's lifestyle based, well, if you have a series of interventions, those interventions could be quite simply exercise, diet. It could even be medication, for example. And you then stick a sensor on, let's say, at the end of every month. And the idea is that maybe for 1 day or 2 days, entirely up to the individual, because what you're trying to see is, well, how did those interventions, all that effort I put in over that month, how has it impacted my ability to regulate my sugar level? And so what that now means is that, well, instead of somebody having to wear a sensor for 10 or 14 days at a time, which is what the existing filament-based sensors are, that you wear them for either 10 days or 14 days. And of course, you've got the associated cost with it. What you now have is the opportunity to just wear a sensor on just 1 day or 2 days at the end of each month. And again, what it means is that it fits in with people's lifestyle. It is something that is not obtrusive, and it's something that is not overly expensive. So to give you an analogy, the invasive sensors, one of the 10-day one, I think, is around $150 for a 10-day sensor. And the 14-day sensor is around the $90 to $100 mark. So even if you wanted to go on a program of, let's say, over a year, and you're going to have interventions every month, and you wanted to monitor yourself just for a couple of days at the end of each month, you still got a sensor that will last you 14 days or 10 days, and you still got to buy that sensor, irrespective of whether you're going to monitor for 1 day or 2 days. Whereas here, literally for a few dollars, you can measure yourself, you can monitor your sugar profile. And so from a cost perspective as well, it becomes extremely attractive. And importantly, what it does is it actually opens up the opportunity for a lot more people to utilize technologies like this or wearable platforms like this to basically look after themselves. That's really what it's all about, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And as a marketer, I have to ask, how big is the addressable market? We're talking, 90% in the type 2, 10% type 1. What are those numbers globally? You're mentioning or even just the markets that you were mentioning on that worldwide scale.
The market is, unfortunately, it's a vast market, and it's growing at a phenomenal rate. Even today, as we speak, there are around 450 million people around the world with diabetes. And then the projections are that that number is going to hit, I think it's around 550 to 600 million by 2030. So,
Wow.
So you can see the sheer scale of this. But here's the scarier thing. Let's take the US, for example. You've got around, I think it's around 34 million people or thereabouts with diabetes. Approximately, I would say about 29 million of those, or 30 million, that have type 2. But guess what? There are just under 90 million people with prediabetes. So you've got about 90 million people who can potentially get type 2 diabetes. And that's the scary thing, because that's a huge number, and the burden that places on healthcare providers is quite significant. And the whole idea here is that, well, if we can nip it in the bud by alerting people to the fact that, hey, look, your level of sensitivity is slightly out of whack. You need to actually get some attention now. And that way you can potentially even avoid contracting diabetes altogether. And wouldn't that be great? Because think about it, not just, park aside the cost savings, because cost-wise, it's anywhere between $4,000 and $20,000 roughly. Those are the figures I've seen in terms of per year to manage somebody who contracts diabetes. But let's park the cost aside, but think about the quality of life, because the sheer scale of complications that arise as a result of diabetes, almost, I think it's about 15% of healthcare budgets around the world are actually spent on managing the complications of diabetes. It's just staggering, And if there ever was a pandemic, this is it. This is one of the major catastrophes of the current era that we live in, and for people to be able to essentially take a proactive approach to managing their health, that's a fantastic thing, because that allows the burden to be reduced on society as a whole. But of course, to enable them to do that, what do you have to do? You've got to empower them, and you've got to empower them with tangible data, tangible insights from which decisions can be made that actually are meaningful. That's what it boils down to ultimately.
Data is only as good as what you do with it, and being able to monitor this as an individual at the healthcare level, beyond the clinical level that you had mentioned, to see these metrics in real time. It could be preventative, like you had mentioned, growing from 450 to 550, 600 million by 2030. That it could drastically reduce that growth rate by being able to identify it, being able to take the right actions on a daily basis on an individual to manage this, to a more stable point, as well as the 45 million that are in type 1, 90% of the 450 that are in type 2, being able to have that real time analysis and make changes on their own on a day-to-day basis as a result. Not even to mention the cost savings, $90, $100 versus $4K, $20K per year, 15% of the healthcare market as a whole. And wanted to touch on the healthcare market. I wanted to kind of put my business hat on for a second. Speak to the investors in the room. How big are the numbers? What is the healthcare cost per year? We're talking 15%. How big of a game is this?
It's substantial. When you look at healthcare, we've got to look at it from, I guess, with a broad lens, because in terms of the cost to, let's say, a nation, right? You've got the direct costs that are involved to healthcare providers, whether that be self-insured, whether that be insurers, corporates, etc. Or when you then look at, for example, the loss in productivity, then of course you've got additional costs involved there. You've then got quality of life of individuals and additional care or support that people may need. You've got another element of cost associated with that. And then you've got a lot of people that struggle with managing diabetes, for example. They also need support. It's not just about, hey, here's a program, go away and follow it. They actually need, often they need handholding, often they need support, they need motivating, etc. So there's costs come from a whole series of sources, I guess, in that regard. But of course, the total addressable market that we've looked at, it is in the US alone, it's in the tens of billions of dollars. In terms of just from a glucose monitoring perspective, okay, and the subsequent management of diabetes. And when that is then combined with support services, the great advantage is that those support services can now be digitized. So in fact, you could have app-based support services that somehow you utilize the data and AI to provide people with prompts, with feedback, with insights, with education, so that they can actually almost sustain a program on their own. And that makes it highly cost efficient for an end user and also, of course, for the payer. So overall, we're talking about a huge addressable market. And of course, sure. I mentioned earlier not to forget about the costs that are incurred in managing the complications of diabetes as well. So if we can either delay or hopefully prevent the onset of long-term complications, then of course you've got another chunk of costs that have been hopefully diminished or reduced.
Sure. And that's important. I know the focus is really the individual health impact. So weight loss, potential reversal of type 2 diabetes, glucose monitoring, and different types of prevention that could come out of it for some of the audiences that you've mentioned. We've already identified how much growth is going to occur in the next 8 to 10 years. Continuous lactate monitoring for athletic performance, non-medical, and different types of use cases from there. But to have those cost savings makes a big difference for an individual, the impact, on the market, that overall market opportunity that I was mentioning. Investors who may not be familiar with this industry, this space, wanted to paint that picture because it is really a massive potential here. And I know you have a very strong management team as well too. It's generally a team that is required to put projects of this caliber, to have this type of impact in the world together. Can you speak more about your team members that you work with?
Yes. So up to now, one of the things we've always been focused on is developing the technology. And so we've literally kept a very, let's say, lean operation from that perspective. And once we got the product developed, clinicals done and approved, we started building our management team. For example, one member of our team, he was formerly with Dexcom in Germany, and Dr. Fred Schapstow, and he was involved in the deployment of the Dexcom CGM, which is one of the other invasive CGMs that I mentioned, and its rollout in Germany initially. And of course, Dexcom has been a runaway success when you consider that they went from something like a $500 million market cap just over about a decade ago to, like, I think last year they hit close to $80 billion. Selling just that one sensor. So you can see the sheer scale of the opportunity there. And then we've hired a chief operating officer, and again, he has an immense track record in terms of developing technologies. And the great thing is he has both a sensor background as well as electronics background. And we're gradually in the process of continuously hiring additional people. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, though, is that as a company, given the type of technology we have, okay, so here's the thing. We could quite easily roll out product, right, whereby it's a subscription based, and somebody just pays, let's say, I don't know, $10, $15 or $20 per month. A million subscribers gives you, you do the figures, it gives you a substantial amount of income, $20, $30 million a month income. And when you consider the actual target market for us in the US alone, combining the type 2 and the prediabetes space, is over 120 million people, you kind of very quickly realize that actually the market is quite significant. And therefore, how are we as a small organization going to scale? Because is it going to be enough because my ambition is not to be selling a couple of 100,000 sensors a month. No chance. We want to be getting our millions of subscribers on board. And there's no reason why they shouldn't, because this is not something that is a nice to have. This is something that provides a real tangible, output that people can actually utilize in order to manage their health, in order to manage their well-being. Okay, so therefore, we believe that the demand could be quite significant. But again, as I say, going back to, if we're targeting many millions of subscribers, how are we going to scale? And in our view, it isn't actually the right approach to go out there and now gradually just mushroom our management team into a huge, big, substantial force. The way we will be doing it is through strategic alliances. And as an example, recently we partnered with an organization in the US called Eversana, and they have a sales force over 6,500 people. There you go. Overnight, you have a team that are well versed in this market. They have the contacts, they have the network, they have the infrastructure, and we will be leveraging off that. So I just wanted to make clear that we're not really going to be looking to go out there and start building a huge big board and team just because we started commercializing. We are going to be looking at the most strategic and the most cost efficient and smartest ways of scaling our marketing and our sales and revenue generation through those kind of partnerships.
I love how that's planned out. And as the owner of a marketing agency that puts together strategic partnerships, projections on what that relationship may be capable of, being able to talk about the growth model as a whole, that's where a lot of my questions live when I'm measuring a high growth company such as your own. So this is very impressive. And I'm curious, to the nature of the show, test, optimize, and scale. What did you have to test to get to this point? What could other listeners look to do? When you said tangible data, that resonates with me because I'm all about packaging actionable insights through this podcast. What
Sure.
can others do to kind of follow in your footsteps in the sense of what did you have to try out before getting the model to this level of refinement?
When you say the model, you're talking about the product or the business or both?
Both essentially, product, business, your overall growth.
Yeah, sure. When we started out, one of the things that we did was that we said, well, we've got to establish whether the technology is actually viable, because a lot of people have been working in this field and they've tried a whole host of different approaches. And whilst we had the theory, whilst we had the endorsement through a significant government grant where they endorsed our, let's say, technology idea, we thought, well, let's just build anything that allows us to, on a functional basis, to determine does a sensor of this nature actually work? Can it be made to work? And so we ended up with a device that you basically would wear around your arm, and it was a huge, big device. Okay, it was like a huge, big armband. But from our perspective, that was perfectly fine because we just wanted to prove the concept. And and of course, we did that at very little cost. When I say very little cost, I mean there are sensor companies out there that have burnt through hundreds of millions of dollars, and we wanted to avoid that mistake where you go too far down the line without actually knowing the viability of the technology. And so we did that functional development. We did some clinical testing, and we went as far as even submitting for CE approval in Europe. And of course, when we got the approval, when the regulators said, yeah, actually that's viable, for us, that was a big tick in the box to say, okay, now is the time to take the technology and let's go and miniaturize it. Let's go and make it something that you can actually commercialize. Okay, and so that was the approach we took. And then, of course, we swiftly moved on from there. And within about 3-4 years of that, we then miniaturized everything, the sensor, the electronics, and we did further clinical studies, and we submitted for approvals there. So that was essentially the process that we followed from the technology perspective. And here as well, with regards to, let's say, and so that was the product. That was how the whole product evolved, the life cycle of the product evolved to where it is today. And even from where we are today, we're not complacent with where we are, because I'd like to take this a step further. So I would like to be in a place in the not too distant future where we can eliminate this altogether, where actually you just have a sensor that you stick on your arm somewhere, and maybe with a smartwatch, it is all you need to actually do the monitoring, for example. So again, we're already looking at, okay, so we've gone from a functional device to something that is commercializable, but what's the next thing? If you actually want millions of people to be using this without even thinking about how do I apply it, how do I use it, etc., then how do you make it so that it is accessible in that manner? And so that's what we're looking at in the background. And from a marketing perspective and sales perspective, we're actually following a very similar strategy, whereby we're going out, we're saying, okay, well, here's a hypothesis. We think this market is a good fit in terms of how our product should be sold, how it should be packaged. And we do a small trial. Like, for example, right now we have trials that we're running with the NHS in the UK. And the idea is not that we want to sell to the NHS, it's just to get that endorsement, to see what the patient feedback is like, so that we can say, okay, that gives us confidence that this is the way to leverage the technology in terms of the clinical angle, let's say, for example.
And how have you been able to optimize that process, particularly the sales and marketing process, and really towards the growth of the organization as a whole? What have been the best approaches to be able to get that to a functional place?
So here's what we find. We are going to do it through partnerships, okay? But whenever we've spoken with, and of course, we're, even as I speak now, we are in discussions with a whole host of potential partners. In fact, we have well in excess of, I think it was a couple of hundred inquiries for licenses from around the world over the last couple of years, and it's just such a huge amount to get through. But one of the things we found is that, well, everybody has their own idea, and a lot of it is not really tested in terms of, well, is that really the right way? So the approach we took is that, well, actually, let us test the water for you, and let us demonstrate to you what is potentially the most optimal way to market in a certain territory, or for a certain, let's say, market. By market, I mean pre-diabetes or weight loss or metabolic health or the type 2 diabetes space. And then we're saying to the partners, well, okay, look, this is what we've demonstrated. And that's why this is how we in partnership should be marketing this. And that allows you to focus, because otherwise what happens is, let's say you get into a partnership and you've not done any work, your partner is none the wiser because this technology does not exist yet elsewhere. And they're going to go away and they're going to waste a lot of time trying to figure out how to position this or how to get this to market. And so being able to do that very early on, and even with small cohorts, we're not talking about tens of thousands or thousands of people, even a few hundreds, is adequate to be able to get feedback that allows you to work in partnership with larger companies in order to make decisions of product positioning and the way the product should be rolled out, basically. It just makes it a lot more efficient than, as I say, just leaving it to the partner to decide, okay, let us go away and do some trials and figure out what we're going to be doing here.
I want to make it as easy as possible for them to be able to roll out and do what they need to do to make it a successful relationship. And what about scale? You see partnerships working. How do you take this to critical mass? How do you take on the market share that you're set out to? What are some tips towards scale that you guys use within the organization and that you would recommend towards listeners?
Scale, it goes back to essentially what I was explaining just now, and that is, on the first hand, we are already looking at, we've already gathered a lot of feedback. And for example, our UK licensee, when they've gone out there, when they've given out devices, most people did not want to give their devices back. They just wanted to keep their devices and just take more sensors because they just loved the idea of being able to pick up their phone and on any day they want to wear a sensor, they can see their data. And so the way we see it is that we've got a choice here. And that is, one is that we could do we could go the organic route if we wanted to, which is gradually build the market share and over the years we grow. Or the way we could view it is that there is a pressing need for a technology of this nature out there in the market today. So therefore, how can we deploy the technology en masse globally? Okay, well, quite clearly, we're not going to be doing it on our own. And so it is, so scaling for us is beyond doubt going to be about partnerships. But the key thing is, what are the right partnerships? Because contrary to, let's say, common belief, it is the right partners may not necessarily be medtech companies. They may not necessarily be pharma companies. Because without naming names, if you look at the consumer electronics or consumer space generally, when you look at some of the companies in those spaces and how fast they've grown and the inroads they're making into healthcare and wearables and things of that nature, you realize that they are not only a lot more innovative, they're a lot more hungrier to get out there, and they are a lot less averse to deploying new technologies for applications like this. So therefore, we're keeping our options open, but ultimately it is going to be scaling for us is going to be about partnering with companies that have the infrastructure ready and they're ready to hit the ground running, basically.
And that ability to move, to hit it running, as you're saying. Yeah. Well, Fawz, I am so fascinated by this discussion. And we've worked with different med tech companies, but hearing the space that you're focusing on on a day-to-day basis, hearing the impact you're having and how large of a demographic of both type 1, type 2 that you're having this type of positive effect on and the potential of the next 5-10 years, it's really impressive. And as we begin to wrap up, want to ask, for any listeners, the best ways to get in touch with you, to get in touch with the organization, if they would like to learn more, as well as any final thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with today.
Yes, sure. Before I forget, in terms of contacting me, through the Nemura Medical website. So nemuramedical.com is our corporate website. Please go there. We have an inquiry form, or you can email directly to inquiries at Nemura Medical. So I'd be more than happy to address any questions anybody may have individually. In terms of, I guess, and again, I really appreciate the opportunity you've given us to talk about our technology today. In terms of thoughts, the thing is, healthcare medicine is moving on, and it's moving on at a pace. Okay, that is the reality. And the one thing that's really moved digital healthcare at the speed it has is of course COVID. We know that because telemedicine, telehealth, and digital medicine, it really took off after COVID, to the extent that now even mobile phone apps are being prescribed. Okay, so therefore, what hopefully viewers will realize is that we're living in an era whereby there will be a very large proportion of individuals out there who will be wanting to take a proactive role in managing their health. Excuse me. So the question becomes, well, how do they do that? Well, to be able to do that, you've got to be able to empower them with technology that gives them insights into what's actually happening inside their bodies. Okay, that's really the core of this, at the core of this. And what we've developed allows precisely that to happen. And of course, once we've deployed the glucose monitoring, we'll be looking at other analytes that we can measure, like stress biomarkers, for example. That's one of the key areas also that we're looking at. And the idea is that hopefully, eventually, what we have is a holistic tool whereby you have a combination of a few sensors that you wear intermittently. I mean, that doesn't have to be even on a weekly or a monthly basis. It could be like on a quarterly basis or once every 6 months, plus some kind of a digital program that whereby you adhere to in terms of interventions to help yourself. And we're going to see a lot more of that. But the companies that will be at the forefront will be the ones with their proprietary technologies, in particular, sensor platforms that allow real insights, real tangible knowledge that can be utilized so for decisions to be made. And so, you know, we're right there. We're right at hopefully at the close to the forefront of that. And so for us as a company, it really is a really exciting time, but also we're quite privileged to be where we are, really, in terms of having taken over a decade to actually develop the technology to be where we are today. You know, it's a great testament to all the hard work and effort that the team has put in place. So, you know, we are looking forward to more successful years ahead.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Fawz, I can't thank you enough for coming in today. Again, to hear about the application of self-monitoring, to be able to see what the wearables open up in terms of prevention. It's really just applaudable what you are doing. And thank you for going into full detail with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much again.
And definitely recommend listeners to get in touch, as Fawz had laid out very open channels to do so. Want to thank all listeners for tuning in here today as well too. And we'll see everyone next time.